So I'm Dr. Alison Murray in the Department of Anthropology, and I'm going to talk a little bit of a different side of understanding life course impacts, I suppose, bringing in some evolutionary approaches to understanding variation in what I'll talk about today, which is female bone health, so bone strength, bone quality, and body composition, body fat, muscle. And ultimately, kind of where my research streams, what they all have in common is trying to understand what's called phenotypic diversity. And phenotype just means observable characteristics. So diversity, not in the genes, but rather in the traits we can see in the body, like your height or how long your legs are, various things like that. And what's really cool about humans is that, there's 7 billion of us on the planet, but we are so genetically similar to each other that we are more genetically similar than Western lowland gorillas are to each other. Yet there's 7 billion of us. So that's a really weird thing because we look so different phenotypically or in these observable traits. We don't look the same, but genetically we're very, very homogeneous. And that paradox I find really interesting. How is this species so genetically similar? We have a very recent shared origin, yet we somehow have spread across the globe. We, look really different. We live really different ways. And I'm interested in why that is and the mechanisms through which that variation is achieved if it's not genes. There's obviously something else going on. And I'm interested in that both globally as a species. So why do humans in different environments look different and how and why, but also within a lifetime. So why one single individual, the way you grow up, the sports you do in your life, the things that you do, how that changes your body as well. And so specifically variation in what, I'm interested in 2 main groups of traits. So this is a really famous picture I like to show in my classes. I think it's from Sports Illustrated or something, of Olympic athletes. And just to give a sense of the variation in observable traits. So height, weight, proportions, body breadth, body composition. So how much fat, how much muscle and lean tissue do you carry? Humans are really, really diverse in these ways, and I'm interested in why. And then I focus on bones as well. So things we can't see, the skeleton underneath these bodies. Bone strength varies a lot, often in relation to what you're doing in your lifetime, but also differs between, in an evolutionary time scale, between other species of hominins like Neanderthals and humans. And recent humans kind of stand out. So I'm interested in why as well. And because I am a small child and like to ask why to everything, I'm going to explain to you why I care about these traits in particular. Who cares about what's shaping bone strength or body size? Well, these are the exact same traits that we're really running into problems with now in industrialized life. Contemporary industrialized populations, things like osteoporosis, overweight and obesity, metabolic disease, so diseases of the heart and the circulatory system, and diabetes. These are unheard of over our evolutionary history. We have no osteoporotic fracture in the fossil record. It's a very recent thing. So I'm interested in why. Why do we get sick in this way, not some other way now? And how can an evolutionary approach help us understand, what's going on with non-communicable diseases now? And it's also really interesting because males, females, and different age groups all have different risks of these diseases, different prevalence. They manifest differently in males and females across the life course. And I think an evolutionary approach can help us answer why that is. And then for bone in particular, well, if I'm trying to understand life in the past, all we have is bone. And so the better we can understand the factors that shaped the variation that we're seeing in individuals, but also between species as we're trying to understand where we came from, who we came from, why we look the way we do now, we only have the bones. So it's really important for that respect from an anthropological perspective. I'm going to tell you a little bit about just two streams of my research that are relevant to lifelong health and aging. And the first is trying to, so I'm just going to move this here, trying to better understand how variation among females in particular is shaped by these underlying energy allocation strategies. So it all comes back to energy when we're talking about evolution, really, but we all have to spend energy across our life cycle. Early on, we might spend it mostly on growing, and then at a certain point, we reach puberty and we will shift where we spend that energy. We'll stop growing, we'll shift towards spending energy on reproductive things. We need to run our immune system if we get sick, and that is expensive. And that means we can't spend that energy on something like growing or reproduction. And just generally existing is expensive. We need to repair and maintain our cells and our tissues. So that's another thing we need to spend money on spend energy on across the life course. And so, you know, different people or different environments, there are optimum strategies that vary depending on the conditions to which you need to deal with in your lifespan. And so the amount of energy that gets allocated to different functions varies in ways that can affect the traits I'm interested in. So you'll all kind of be familiar with that if, you know, malnutrition in early life can be associated with shorter height in children, because there's not enough energy to grow properly. They prioritize energy to other more important functions that are critical for survival. So these are real-time trade-offs that are important for the traits that I'm interested in, for growth and reproductive traits, and also for building strong, big organs, which you need, or if you don't do that, you're more at risk of metabolic health issues. So some of my work has then been investigating how, amongst females, variation in bone, muscle, and fat might actually be reflecting some of these energy allocation strategies and decisions enacted across the life course and influenced intergenerationally. So this is one of the big ways in which social determinants of health actually affect health, is because they influence these energetic strategies. So for example, just a study we published in 2018 out of some of my postdoc work, I'd recruited a group of athletes and controls for a separate study, and I just happened to ask them their birth weight, and of course their age at menarche we were interested in anyways. And birth weight is really interesting because it's a kind of a proxy for energy availability in fetal life. So how much can your mother invest in your growth? So it's, in that sense, there's some intergenerational aspect there. And then age at menarche is a good proxy for developmental pace. How much time did you spend growing? How quickly did you reach reproductive maturity? So what we found is this is a group of healthy young adult Cambridge University undergrads, athletes, control subjects. How tall they were and how much body fat they had was strongly predicted by these life history markers. So the girls that were on the lower end of birth weight tended to have their first period sooner, which means they were growing for less time. So they were shorter. They sort of prioritized reproduction. So they had earlier age at menarche and more body fat, which among females, of course, is a reproductive energy reserve that we can draw on for pregnancy, breastfeeding. Whereas those life history traits, it didn't really matter for their bone strength. That was entirely whether they were an athlete or not, which makes sense. Physical activity really important for maximizing bone strength, bone density, and their muscle area. So what we sort of pulled out of here was that physical activity is the most crucial thing, much more important than life history, for maximizing bone quality, bone density, and lean tissue. But it wasn't the most important thing affecting their body fat. It wasn't, the athletes were lean, the control subjects had regular, less lean body types. Adiposity was it was much more shaped by how old they were when they got their first period. These sort of reproductive and developmental sort of trade-offs that was a much stronger predictor than whether or not they were an athlete. So just goes to show that there are, you know, multiple factors at play. It's not just calories in equals calories out, just be physically active, you'll lose body fat. There are these sort of really deep evolutionary components to why we look the way we do that are relevant for health. And a second stream of my research explores the bone in particular. So how does bone among females, I also look at males, but mostly females, how does that reflect, what factors are shaping that? And it's interesting, and why there would be sex differences here is because female bones are metabolically important for reproduction. They are mineral reserves. So this is something that male bone doesn't have to worry about, basically. And so there's a difference in terms of the factors affecting the bone. So that's why I had collected these scans in the first place. I was interested in how these girls' different sports contributed to their bone strength, bone density, and muscle force. So how strong were their muscles as well. So we got them in, this athlete gave consent for a photo. This is a little scanner that we use to generate these pictures. So the shin bone and the calf muscle, and the light gray is body fat and subcutaneous fat. And this is where we get bone density from at the ankle. In a runner and a control subject, you can see visibly there's differences in the shape of their bones. But basically, what was interesting about this, well, we published a bunch of papers on this stuff, but what we noticed was that some of what we were seeing was telling us about stuff they'd been doing when they were kids, which I wasn't necessarily interested in. I was interested in the sport they were doing right now. We were thinking, oh, okay, some of the variation that we're seeing in their bones is reflecting stuff that they are not doing right now necessarily. It's what they had done as kids. But it wasn't the whole bone that was reflecting that. It was only some parts of the bone were influenced by past training, not all of them. And so in these groups, it's really just the bone shaft that was reflecting their past activity, not bone density. So we started wondering, like, oh, are different components of the same bone reflecting loading that you did at different points across your life cycle? And like, who cares? Well, that's a big deal if we're trying to target physical activity intervention programs or prevention initiatives. Do we focus on seniors? Do we focus on kids? I mean, it depends. It might depend what you're trying to maximize. And that's also a big deal for biological anthropology, because we often don't have a lot of remains of children and adolescents. So if an adult bone can tell you about behavior when that person was a kid, that is a big deal. So that's the study I'm going to talk to you a little bit about from the rest of my time today, is this exploring this question, basically. And to do that, I teamed up with Dr. Marta Erlandson at the University of Saskatchewan College of Kinesiology. She and I used to do track together, so we've known each other a really long time and have always wanted to publish something together. So this was our big moment. So she's worked extensively with childhood elite gymnasts and following them after retirement, and what happens to their bone mass. Are the benefits maintained? She published a lot in that area. So we combined her data set with mine to get a set of five nice groups that differed in how much impact they were doing and when. So low, moderate, or high impact loading, either before puberty, after puberty, or both. So she supplied the data from gymnasts. So we have some control subjects. We've got gymnasts who were very elite as kids and then retired. So high impact loading before menarche, low after, not doing anything. And some of those gymnasts went on to do other sports that were very high impact. So we considered that kind of lifelong high impact loading. And then we've got soccer players and runners grouped together as sort of moderate impact loading, that if they started before menarche and were still doing it, we consider that sort of lifelong, versus some of the runners and soccer players only started that sport after they had their first period. And before that, we're pretty, recreationally active or sedentary. So we're interested in, okay, what what's going on in the shin bone? Can we detect these differences? So these are some scans of age, height, and weight matched control subject and our extremes. So elite gymnasts who retired around puberty, and the kind of opposite, someone who only started running after puberty as a teenager. So we are looking at shin bone, fibula, so tibia, fibula, light gray is calf, dark gray is subcutaneous fat. And what we found was that that bone shaft, so this is the tibia, the bone shaft was significantly stronger and larger only in people who did loading prior to puberty. It did not matter what they were doing now at all. It only mattered what they had done before puberty. This is not...
9:45, it just changed for people.
I'm going to mute. So not significantly different despite this runner having run for 7 years, doesn't matter. It's the gymnastics in childhood. We've got 56% higher bone strength still, and she is sedentary, not done anything. For how long has she not done anything for? 6 years. So an opposite story in the bone density. The volumetric bone mineral density of the ankle, significantly higher than controls, only if you were doing recent current stuff. So this runner currently active, gymnast not. So not significantly different than controls in bone density, despite 25 hours a week of gymnastics for 12 years as a kid. Doesn't matter. It's the current activity who is associated with better bone density. So physical activity throughout the life course matters, both for bone strength and bone density, but for different reasons and through different parameters. So either cortical bone geometry or trabecular bone density. These two things together contribute to osteoporosis and fracture risk. Osteoporosis is not just about low bone density. You can have osteoporotic fracture with normal bone density. You can have really bad bone density and not fracture, because what's going on in the bone shaft also matters. And together, those two things contribute to the bone's fracture risk. And so if we want to maximize both of those things together, well, we need to target different times in the life course. Also, for my purposes, super cool because this sort of whole bone approach might let us learn about behavior across the life course in someone that died as an adult. Great, and just to end, what's next? Good timing here. I want to look at the hormonal mechanism underlying how energy is shifted between different functions. So this is all done by hormones like insulin and hormones from body fat and bone. And so I want to kind of look at that in more detail because this system evolved in a context of constant physical activity, which in industrialized countries we don't do anymore. And so could this be why we are getting these epidemics of metabolic disease now? And to do that, we work with ultramarathon runners who willingly and voluntarily put themselves in extreme energetic stress, and we can look at what happens before and after their races. And I also want to look more in detail at the metabolic functions of bone. So looking at including women who have had children, lactated, and who are postmenopausal, because I mostly just work with young adult university students. Thank you very much to my collaborators on these projects, Jay and Marta, and all the women who spend ages letting me scan them, and this work was funded by the European Research Council and NSERC. And that is me. Thank you very much for listening.